Hello, I'm Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Information power undergirds China's assertive rise in the world. In this program, 4 other experts join me to discuss U.S. and Australian views of China's Techno-Authoritarianism, political interference, and influence operations. This program is the third of a 3-part discussion on the myriad ways China uses information power to gain economic, technological, and security advantage. Earlier discussions focused on China's weaponization of information and supply chain security. And check out the Hudson podcast with Clive Hamilton, whose 2018 book, Silent Invasion, alerted his fellow Australians to the scope and scale of China's quiet encroachment. Australia has been a bellwether of Beijing's exploitation of information power on advanced democracies. Australia has been subjected to CCP United Front influence operations, cyber and information campaigns, brazen attempts at political interference, unrelenting propaganda, and Beijing envelops its actions with discourse power and the use of fabricated narratives. The US experience is quite similar. As FBI Director Christopher Wray told the Hudson Institute last summer, quote, "China doesn't hesitate to use smoke mirrors and misdirections to influence Americans," unquote. Beijing means business, and its words and actions often transcend the bounds of public diplomacy. Operation Fox Hunt, for instance, is China's global covert program to track down dissidents, using blackmail and other means to force dissenters in the US to return home. Now, espionage is to be expected from intelligence services and the military. Hence, it's no surprise those affiliated with the PLA and national security apparatus make use of our open university and research environments to gain access and collect data. Confucius Institutes and Thousand Talent programs have given the CCP wide access to scholars and R&D organizations. It's up to us to do a better job of screening and defending what really matters. The point is that information is integral to China's hard power and core security goals. As Elsa Kanya has written, Xi Jinping is fixated on the ideological battlefield and party state survival, and information dominance is at the center of these efforts, whether it's the PLA's 3 warfares that comprise public opinion, legal, and psychological warfare, or China's military modernization for fighting and winning informatized warfare, or China's concept of comprehensive national power that demands information dominance. China is becoming a cyber superpower and information superpower. Indeed, the concept of information power intersects all of China's tools, not just hard power for military security, but also soft and sharp power activities, including propagating techno-authoritarianism and conducting both political interference and influence operation. Now, there are at least 5 types of overlapping information power activities from China that I hope this program will at least touch on. First, propaganda and disinformation that are baked into state-controlled media and party state activities. China's response to the pandemic provides all of this in a microcosm. Second, China engages in a wide variety of influence operations, often to silence critics and win support for China's goals or to gain valuable access and information. In fact, congressional committees have long been taking testimony on the long arm of China, global efforts to silence critics from Tiananmen today, to cite one old hearing topic. But the problem has grown worse, and Beijing insists on projecting unalloyed confidence through the bullhorn of wolf warrior diplomacy. Consider the list of grievances that Australia must address to halt free-falling relations with China, maybe something we'll hear about. Third, more aggressively, China wages information operations that integrate electronic, cyber, and psychological warfare to weaken a target actor's information and decision-making and to augment one's own. China is widely seen as the culprit behind the hacking of Microsoft Exchange, which could have opened up a large number of vulnerabilities for further information operations. Fourth, China occasionally crosses into direct political interference. While Russia and Iran tried to interfere with the 2020 US election, the intelligence community judges that China did not. China has, however, sought to muzzle critics and has been particularly active at attacking US allies. For instance, Canadian Foreign Minister Marc Garneau warns that the price for countries of doing business with China is the arbitrary detention of their citizens. And fifth, let's consider narrative and discourse power, which for China is the ability to guide and shape debate, including in a contingency. Most are familiar with the common tropes of China: century of humiliation, China dream, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is contrasted often with a declining America to contain China's peaceful rise. China acts as if historical victimization entitles it to victimize others today. It uses milestone years like 2021 and 2049 to bookend aspirations that seem inevitable, but only if you ignore all of the inconvenient evidence, such as glossing over demographics or internal oppression. So let's turn to our panelists for some of their insights and judgments about some of these issues, about the challenges, and about what responses we are needed. Let me just introduce the panel quickly, and then we'll go in this order that I'll introduce them. Dr. Samantha Hoffman is a senior policy analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's International Cyber Policy Center. She's written extensively on the Chinese Communist Party's technology-enhanced political and social control efforts. For instance, she has written on China's e-currency, social media credit, and how the CCP engages in data collection on a massive scale as a means of generating information to enhance state security. Dr. Charles Edel is a global fellow at the Wilson Center and a senior fellow at the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney. He's the co-author of The Lessons of Tragedy, Statecraft and World Order, and he's author of Nation Builder, John Quincy Adams and the Grand Strategy of the Republic. Currently, he's working on a book examining America's history of dealing with authoritarian regimes. Harry Krejsa is a cyber advisor within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, on leave from the Center for a New American Security. His research areas include Chinese geopolitical and economic statecraft and cybersecurity and technology competition. Mr. Krejsa worked as a professional staff member for the Congressional Joint Economic Committee, and he was a Fulbright Fellow in Taiwan, among many other accolades. Dr. John Lee is a senior fellow with me at Hudson Institute. He's also a senior fellow at the United States Studies Center and adjunct professor at the University of Sydney. He served as a senior national security advisor to Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, and he was the foreign minister's lead advisor on the landmark 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper. So without further ado, let's dig in. Let's start with Dr. Samantha Hoffman. Sam, how does the China challenge and information power in Australia look to you?
So an important starting point in order to understand how the PRC is attempting to control its information environment, both domestically and globally, is the state security concept. And the reason is that the Chinese party state says that its own political security is at the core of that concept. And it says it's protected by things like its ideological security and cultural security, which ultimately means that the party's version of the truth is the only version of the truth that matters. And protecting the PRC's state security, and the party's version of what China's future is, what Chinese culture is. Those are the only versions that it believes are true, essentially. The other key point is, so politics is at the core of the state security concept. That's important. And the other key point is that we shouldn't think of the state security concept in terms of, say, domestic or foreign security, because really it's everything inside of the party and then everything outside of it. And that has no geographic borders, especially if you think about the kinds of threats that the Chinese party state is attempting to mitigate, which could be things like, when you look at the color revolutions, it's a very real threat perception for the party. And the kinds of groups of individuals, political opponents of the party that can organize against it, both exist inside and outside of the PRC. And so those are ideological and political threats, but they're things that are very real to the party. So that's one important thing to keep in mind. Now, when we think about the methods that the party uses in order to ensure state security, one of the key concepts that I've focused on in my research is the concept of social management. And social management is the idea of essentially shaping, controlling, and managing the party's operating environment inside of China, but increasingly also outside of China, especially given the especially sort of from the 2000s onward, you start to see the party talking about how the internet and how the information environment is changing in a way that efforts related to social management also have to extend outward. And that's found in China's concept of global governance. It's found in things like when Xi Jinping says building a common destiny for mankind. There's even a concept of international social management. Now, one of the ways that the party attempts to guarantee state security through effective social management is through tech-enhanced tools of control. So essentially the same methods of governing that you've seen for quite a long time, but with technology meant to augment the process. And that's where things like smart cities or social credit all come in as important elements of that broader ecosystem. And something like smart cities, I think, is quite a useful example in order to understand the information environment and how the party tries to control it. Because essentially, smart cities technologies, they're things that provide services. They're things that are helping the party improve efficiency and governance. They aren't all about coercive control. Of course, that's a huge part of it. Surveillance systems, facial recognition systems, voice recognition systems, all sorts of things that you can associate with smart cities. But smart cities is also about improving urban management as well. But also what comes from those technologies is data, and how that data is processed and then used can both serve service provision as well as informing the party state about other aspects of how it needs to, again, shape, manage, and control its operating environment. And so I want to focus on the case study in Engineering Global Consent, which is a paper that I published with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in October 2019. And my starting point for this paper was, well, in the global public debate on China and technology, we're always focused on Huawei. And oftentimes we focus on issues like espionage, but I think the problem is a lot broader than Huawei. It's broader than any particular company. And the kinds of data that can be acquired aren't just about intelligence. It's also serving other purposes. Because when you look at what the party says, they say, well, propaganda is one aspect, but it's also data can feed into a lot of other systems, things like the social credit system and so on. And I won't go into detail about that in 5 minutes, but just to say that there are a lot of different things at play. And so I was looking for a specific example that would be representative of all those things. And I found a company called Global Tone Communications Technology. And this company, really, there was nothing about it in English when I came across it, only the company's own PR materials, but there was a lot in Chinese language material. And this company is actually controlled by the Central Propaganda Department. And what they do is they provide translation services. And through the translation services, the data they collect supports normal provision of, so improving translations, improving the quality of translations, but it also supports, according to the company's own statements, supports through collection of facial recognition, or from voice recognition data, from image recognition data, and from text recognition data. It supports state security, and it supports state security in terms of things like military intelligence, but also propaganda, relationship mapping, and sentiment analysis, for instance, are things that they're able to do with the data that they collect. And the interesting thing about it is that this company's technologies, well, none of them are things that we would think about as inherently threatening. They engage in machine translation, but their products are embedded in, according to their own statements, embedded in Alibaba Cloud translation services. They're also embedded in Huawei smart conferencing solutions. And so even though the company itself isn't well known, they're embedded in the supply chains of other better known companies. And so then you've really got a data security in the supply chain issue, which is a part of the supply chain conversation that isn't really discussed. But then the other issue is that actually from the data that the party's collecting, they're able to generate the information that they need to more effectively in the long term engage in propaganda. For instance, there's a suggestion that the kind of research that GTCom engages in could be used to generate fake news comments, because GTCom, they're collecting data in 67 languages. And so the more effective they are at messaging in those languages, then the more, over the long term, that automatic generation of news comments might help the objectives of the propaganda department. There are perfectly legitimate reasons to do that research, and it's not very technically difficult to do what this company is doing. What's different in this case is actually the intent behind it. So I know I only have 5 minutes, so I'll stop there, only to say that I think that when we think about how the party shapes its information environment, we need to think beyond issues like censorship. We need to think about how normal technologies that provide services, not just coercive technologies like surveillance systems, can also support this broader effort to shape, manage, and control the party's operating environment domestically and globally.
Sam, that's very interesting, and your research is cutting edge and very important. But what you're describing, when I hear this, is, and I'm turning to Charlie now, and maybe get a historical view as well as somebody who's been in policy planning at the State Department and has lived in Australia as well as the United States. It's almost a unitary system that you cannot really change. You can't alter the Chinese approach, the CCP approach, right? Whether it's the technology or the fact that it's saving the party and the social management at the same time. It's collecting data. It's doing it coercively. It's doing it, in a cooperative, friendly way. It's doing it surreptitiously or covertly. All of the above, but it's kind of a system. And so when I turn to Charlie and I think about things like when America thinks about public diplomacy and discourse power and narrative, we're talking about how do we sell, how do we market foreign policy, how do we market the US, but we're not necessarily tied down into social management of the system or into the industry or into even other parts of the government. So Charlie, how does this seem to you in terms of the nature of this challenge from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. And Sam, thanks for that terrific presentation and really this stellar group that you have lined up for these. These U.S. Australia conversations have been really fun and really much appreciated now that I'm back in my homeland and not my adopted one, Patrick. But look, to answer your question, allow me to actually start by talking about a Freudian slip. And when you emailed me and the rest of us asking about this webinar that you were going to put on, you said that we'd be discussing salient challenges and effective responses to China's information, influence, and interference operations, including its so-called discourage power and attempts to alter narratives. Now, I'm pretty sure, Patrick, you meant to write discourse power and not discourage power. But perhaps the two are actually not that far apart here, as Beijing's use of information power can be characterized as both efforts that are offensively intended, that is, efforts that are meant to shape a favorable narrative conducive to advancing Beijing's interests, and defensive, aiming at discouraging, suppressing, and silencing unfavorable narratives, some of which Sam was just talking about. So actually, when you ask me how I think about that, I want to break it down along those two lines. On the offensive side, I'd actually point to Nadège Rolland's work on discourse power, which she defines as Beijing's ability to speak on the international stage and be listened to influence others' perceptions of China, and eventually to shape how people talk about and even what they mean by the norms that underpin the international order. As an example of this, let me take one of those very innocuous terms that we all know well, peaceful rise, that was coined in 2003 and deliberately used by China in an attempt to mitigate foreign concerns about the growth of Chinese power. Now, the individual who coined that phrase, who was serving as the vice president of the Central Party School at the time, said that it was merely a tactic to advance China's interests. In his own words, quote, working in this way has its advantages in obtaining greater understanding, sympathy, and support, in winning discourse power on the question of China's development path, in winning discourse power in the international sphere. Now, in practice, this includes the utilization of a combination of coercive and interference measures designed to intimidate or silence opposing views, economic incentives that are intended to seduce and alternatively attract players, and alternative international institutions whose purpose is to lock in Beijing's advantages. Now, think about this in terms of how the largesse is spread around. So investments from the Chinese government or CCP-linked organizations to state governments, to universities, to think tanks around the world has been used to create more favorable perceptions of China, to incentivize more benign relations with Beijing, and to shape the choices of leaders within these organizations. Beijing and CCP-run organizations have financially incentivized individuals by donating to their political campaigns, placing them on corporate boards, organizing lucrative advisory positions, and occasionally offering outright bribes. But Beijing also has used its influence to shift the rules from within, advancing alternative arrangements, redefining norms of behavior in emerging domains, and shaping institutions to reflect its own interests and political values. Take the United Nations. China has exerted growing influence over how the UN defines, supports, and monitors human rights, with the clear aim of weakening UN oversight of Chinese human rights violations. Now, at least as I understand, that's all on the offensive end. On the defensive angle, which is it's really aimed at discouraging narratives deemed unfavorable to and by the Chinese Communist Party. I think nowhere is this more clear, and Patrick, you alluded to this in your opening remarks, than how Beijing has responded to and continues to respond to the coronavirus pandemic. From the outbreak of COVID-19, there was and continues to be a consistent official Chinese state effort to control, limit, and distort information, all with the intent of deflecting blame. Another example that comes right in this area are the efforts to avoid talking about Xinjiang through deflection, through denials, through limiting access and information, and through orchestrating international choruses of supporters. Finally, because we're talking about Australia, let me close with perhaps the most ham-handed example of this phenomenon, the 14 points. And I'm not discussing Woodrow Wilson's vision for ending World War I here, but rather the Chinese embassy's public list of 14 points of grievance it delivered to Australia in November. And if you're not familiar with these included everything from a grievance at Australia's banning Huawei from the rollout of Australia's 5G network, the passing of foreign interference legislation, the calling for an independent international inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus, and general anger at the Australian media for investigative journalism, Australian politicians for their statements condemning Beijing's actions, and Australian think tanks, like the one where Sam works, for producing research highlighting forced labor in and beyond Xinjiang. And I note that while this might have been ham-handed and might have largely backfired in Australia, in this at least, Beijing has made perfectly clear what it aims to do with attempts to control the information environment. It means controlling not just information or discourse, but really the policies of foreign governments as well. And I think I can leave it at there for opening comments, Patrick.
Terrific comments, Charlie. Thank you so much. I want to turn now and get more of deeper into a kind of a policy discussion almost on U.S. and Australian policy. But Harry, I don't want to put you on the spot with that. I do, as you think about your response to any aspect of this challenge from your perspective and expertise, I wonder if though you could give a view about whether the general sense of the readiness of the U.S. government in terms of our organization, our understanding, is our understanding reflective of the things that Sam and Charlie have talked about, for instance? I mean, do we get it? I mean, do we understand it as a macro sense, not necessarily your office, which I hope does understand this in depth, but generally in the American people, because I'm going to ask John the same question about Australia. To what extent is there a shared understanding of the challenge of this problem, and what are some of the difficulties of responding? We'll get into the response later, but just in terms of our understanding of the issue. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Patrick. And I'm really thrilled to be here with this just great group of people. And I hope I get to live up to the example that everyone's set here so far. In short, to answer your question, yes. And but I think that we're making great progress in this direction. And I'd say that 3, 4, 5 years ago, I would have been more pessimistic on a lot of these questions, but I have been encouraged by how quickly the United States and Australia have kind of repostured their thinking, both in government and across civil society and industry, in response to changing data. As we get more information, I've been encouraged by how everyone's understanding of this problem set has updated. And I think that if you ask, any of my DoD strategist colleagues about geopolitical imperatives generally, they'll tell you that a competitor is someone who's always going to try and find asymmetric advantage, and explicitly trying to find ways to blunt a competitor's comparative strengths and exploit their comparative weaknesses. And I think that American strategists are increasingly recognizing this behavior in China, that that Xi Jinping's China is actively trying to use the cyber and information environments to seek that asymmetric advantage, to blunt the strengths that the United States and Australia and similar allies share, while exploiting their weaknesses. And indeed, it seems that they feel that the cyber and informational environments are particularly promising venues to try and do that. The United States and Australia have vibrant advanced economies, and so they are seeking to blunt those strengths through theft and mass data exfiltration. The United States and Australia have tremendously formidable combined military strength, and so China is trying to find ways to achieve their objectives without confronting that military strength. But we also know that China, like Russia, is interested in blunting one of our most important advantages, our pluralist democratic values, and the power of the example that those values hold. And to be clear, China's correct that those values are a comparative advantage of ours and something that they should try to be blunting. They're the values that we in Australia and other vibrant democracies share. They're a source of dynamism, of resilience, and naturally something that China would be right to strategically fear. I do think that there is some danger of us psyching ourselves out on this issue, because I increasingly will hear some pessimists say that our democratic values and our open societies are also making us asymmetrically vulnerable to those various cyber and information enabled operations, that we have more exposure points and opportunity for manipulation. And to be sure, a lot of that is true. Too often, China and Russia and others do find those entry points because of our comparatively open societies and political systems. But we don't have to help China turn our strengths into weaknesses. We should be working hard to ensure that our values remain strengths and can become even stronger strengths. And that means operationalizing our values and doing it into the technologies that are defining our strategic environment in the world today and in the years to come. And in so doing, providing an affirmative vision that contrasts with China and Russia's grim techno-authoritarianism. As Sam was describing earlier, this kind of broad surveillance and censorship regime that China employs domestically, it is, a technological feat, but it is, I think we should remember, while it can appear as an awe-empowering feat of state power, it's also a monument to their weakness. China fears their own public having too much information and too much freedom to discuss that information. And so they're expending just tremendous amounts of effort to prevent that, to catch and control that, to take examples of normal everyday data, like good government management kinds of things that Sam was describing, and weaponize it to political ends. And the fact is that China's government believes that their existential threats includes Americans, Australians, and Chinese. And that is an asymmetric advantage for democracies like Australia and the United States. And to be sure, Beijing's trying to convert their weakness into a strength by turning it into an export, trying to package up their surveillance and censorship regimes into something they can sell abroad to other authoritarians. And this threatens to normalize that techno-authoritarianism, give them valuable hooks into other countries, networks, and political environments. And also, very importantly, as Charles was describing, contesting the narrative of our free, secure, and inclusive vision of what the internet should be, and trying to create this discourse that is antithetical to that vision that the United States, Australia, and many of our similar allies, South Korea and Taiwan and others throughout the region, share. And it is the pointier end of that discouraging discourse effort that China's engaging in. Now, I think our model is better and our vision is more attractive, but we just need to remember that technology is not values neutral. That if we don't help build values that the United States and Australia and like-minded countries that will recognize and respect, if we don't build those into the technologies and frameworks that are going to define our society and future, then someone else's values will fill that vacuum. And one of the reasons why I'm optimistic about whether the United States government and the governments of our allies are able to posture that is because I see that happening. I see us talking more in those terms and taking more steps to make sure that techno-authoritarian visions are not going uncontested in the kind of nitty-gritty of technological standards, of norms buildings, the hard work of statecraft that is closer to where the rubber meets the road in cyberspace.
Well, in the second round, we're going to come back to you, Harry, and the rest of the panel to talk about what we can do, should be doing. But obviously, you've given us the guidelines right there, which is to come up with operationalizing the values inside the technology, inside the rules that govern information and cyber systems. But when we don't even have a data privacy sort of understanding inside the United States, can we then just instantly come up with an agreement with Australia or with Europe and others? And there's a lot of work still to be done. Yet let's get John still on the problem, not just the solutions yet, because John Lee has really been in a privileged seat here. I mean, working with Julie Bishop, where you were kind of having some bracing meetings with the Chinese. I recall, maybe within the bounds of normal diplomacy, but also buffeted by a lot of this information sort of campaign that was going on. The pace has just been feverish, John, too. And so the question is, in your view, has Australia really kept up with this? It seems like Australia has been at the forefront of passing legislation, certainly, to try to deal with some of the pernicious aspects of this from China and others. But is that continuing, or is there kind of is there a pause in Australia right now saying, well, we've went too far, or do we go far enough? And anyway, your characterization of the challenge.
Sure. I'll get to where I think Australia is at very shortly, but I just wanted to frame how big this challenge was or is. When I entered government in 2016, as a government, as all our officials, our politicians, we're all very clear-eyed about what China was doing and what China was up to. But I think what shocked me was that there was a real sense of fatalism in large parts of our whole system, a real sense of defeatism. And it sort of caused me to try to understand why that was the case. And this goes back to your comments at the beginning about China being very successful at shaping discourse and shaping the way we talk, particularly about China in the world. And the Communist Party, I think, has been extremely successful at a few things in this context. It has very successfully conflated the Communist Party with the Chinese people and even with Chinese civilization and history. And this is partly down to the dominance and manipulation of official histories and Chinese language media and publications. And this is extremely effective because once you attack the Communist Party for anything, you're immediately accused of attacking the Chinese people and a great civilization, which puts us in a very uncomfortable position. The party has also been very successful at controlling grand narratives about where the region is heading. And in essence, the party's narrative is this: The most obvious one is China's rise is inevitable, its dominance is inevitable, and American decline or relative decline is inevitable. The second one is that the Chinese Communist Party is inherently undeterrable, and that the US and that the Chinese Communist Party will pay any price to achieve its objectives. And what that means, if you accept that, is that it is the United States and allies such as Australia that need to compromise to avoid disaster. And the third grand narrative I think they've been very successful at is to say that democratic systems or systems based on individual rights are inherently indulgent, corrupt, and chaotic, while those based on collective rights, such as the authoritarian Chinese system, will inevitably be more successful. They are much better problem solvers. And that really has very strong cachet inside Australia and in the region. And you can imagine how, if you accept these narratives, they shape the way states behave, even if they don't like what China is doing in the region. Let me move to the domestic element of Chinese information power or capacity to shape discourse, because this really is a direct threat to our democracies. And I think this is really where Australia has come out the strongest. The domestic element of threat, or a large part of it, comes from the party's dominance of Chinese language content and the success of the party in shaping what is sociable or prohibited discourse on Chinese language platforms. And in Australia, and I imagine perhaps in America as well, the majority of immigrants from mainland China, those who are now Australian citizens or permanent residents, they receive most of their content from Chinese language social media platforms such as WeChat. And even when they do consume traditional media, it's largely Chinese language media such as newspapers or radio. And even in those sorts of outlets in Australia, the Chinese Communist Party and entities associated with the party have been extremely successful at either weaponizing information through these platforms, or at least sanitizing information on these platforms. Now, this is not to say that the majority of Chinese Australians are brainwashed. I'm not saying that at all. I think it's more the case that the party has had an enormously influential role in defining what is sociable discourse, what is acceptable conversation, and what is prohibited conversation amongst Australian Chinese communities. And of course, many Australian Chinese communities have relatives or business interests back in the mainland, and they are reluctant to become people of interest to those in Australia reporting back to Communist Party entities. So so I've tried to frame the challenge in terms of the external and narrative challenge, and also the direct attacks on our institutions, that kind of challenge. It's well known, the sort of legislation and other provisions that the Australian government has taken to combat particularly those external interference in our institutions aspects. And I think on the external influence aspect, Australia is doing extremely well and continuing to do extremely well with assistance actually from think tanks like SAM's. On the grand narrative or challenging those grand narratives, I think it's starting to become clear that those narratives do need to be challenged, but I think we're still at a very early stage of working out what to do about that. So I'll stop there and happy to get further into detail.
John, no, terrific comments. I know there are so many facets of this problem, and in an hour we can only get to so much, but that's all right. We're trying to whet people's appetite. We're trying to get a sense of where are some major convergences or divergences, especially when you think about two really close allies like Australia and the United States, and they're faced with this broad challenge from China in information power. And it's not all coercion, and it's not all co-option, and some of it we don't see, and some of it we clearly don't understand. But how do we deal with this? So let's, in this final 20 minutes or so, let's try to figure out what your top line recommendations are. And I'll go back to the regular order here and start with Sam and say, Sam, where do we go? We don't have to compete with China on electronic commerce and use big data the same way they use big data. So what is the solution, or what are some of the things that U.S. and Australia can be doing to mitigate the challenge here?
I'd like to touch on some of what Harry raised, because I think they're important points, but I also have a bit to add in that I think we recognize that values are baked into the technologies that are coming out of the PRC. And we recognize that we need to have an alternate version that is conducive with the values of liberal democracies. But we have some fundamental problems that we need to address before we actually can successfully do that. One is, I think I've noticed living in Europe, coming from the United States, now living in Australia, I realized that definitions of liberal democratic values vary some. And it sounds a bit pedantic, but I think it's important to really think about what do we mean when we say liberal democratic values, and how does that translate? And that's it's a hard conversation to have with the general public as well, but it's one that I think we need to be thinking about in order to make sure that we're actually really addressing the core problems. The other thing is when we think about issues like anything from dual use technologies to supply chain security, standard setting, things like privacy, we really need to think about those issues a little bit more holistically, in the way that not in the same way that the Chinese party state thinks about them, but I think it's useful to go to their definitions of those concepts, understand how broad they are, and then only through that can you actually come up with your own definition that's also addressing the problem that the PRC is creating. Something like dual use technology, oftentimes we're thinking about the surveillance systems or things like rather than the fact that basically really it's all technology that's collecting data. Any smart technology, any smart cities technologies, for instance, all of it is dual use all the time. It's not one or the other. It's always both in the way that the party uses them. So we need to understand it in that way. When we talk about supply chain security, I mentioned in my talk that I think that we aren't really thinking about the built-in insecurity, data insecurity in the supply chain. And that's something like the GTCOM example, where you might be thinking about Huawei, but you aren't thinking about its suppliers, and something like GTCOM and the propaganda department getting all that data, as well as Huawei as part of normal business activity. So I think in order to really solve the problems, we need to be thinking a little bit more broadly about the issues. And right now I see that the conversation's in the right direction conceptually, but when you get down to the details, I think we're still far off from where we need to be in order to really address the problem.
Sam, in just 30 seconds, how would you portray the role of the private sector and government working to come up with solutions?
I think that they need to talk more. That's probably something that a lot of people say, but I think it needs to happen. It needs to happen, and if it doesn't, then I think tech companies aren't going to understand the needs of government, but then also government has a difficult time understanding the difficulties of. Well, here's a quick example. Trying to build a website right now for a project that we're about to launch, and thinking about what I want as from the end of the project management, rather than how difficult it is for the developers to guarantee privacy under GDPR and things like that. There's a huge technical challenge there. It's not just the ideas.
Excellent. Charlie, when you think about solutions or some of the issues that have already been discussed, including operationalizing values, but digging deeper and having that basic discussion about liberal values, you've looked at it through history in terms of those liberal values, but there is no consensus right now. In fact, there's quite a dissensus in many ways, even in the American body politic, which is a challenge. So we have a lot of work to do. So where do you start in terms of trying to apply some of the wisdom of solutions to this problem?
So I'm not going to offer solutions, but let me offer kind of three ways that I think about what are our comparative, our asymmetric advantages as we have this conversation. So the first is a very obvious one. It's not even actually one of mine. It's sunlight, transparency. It's the best disinfectant for disinformation. But we all know that that's easier said than done, particularly given how difficult it is to fight disinformation within our own systems, as we've seen on broad display over this past year. So actually beyond sunlight, let me suggest three broad lines of effort that I actually think hold great promise. The first is in the psychological realm. Specifically, John and I were talking and we really wanted to disagree, but I can't disagree with him on this. He laid out, I think, three of the most important narratives that need to be punctured: that China is incapable of being deterred, that it's bound to dominate the region, and that its political economic model is efficient. We could add Graham Allison's that China and the US are destined for war. That's another one that needs to be punctured, I think. Each of these narratives is highly problematic and worthy of scrutiny, but it's really important to note that to a greater or lesser degree, all of these lines are more or less seen as truthy or pervasive around the region. And therefore, I think that one of the critical lines of effort will be figuring out ways to puncture those myths, which means thinking about who we want to choose as our best puncturers. Not all will be government-led. What are the best settings and mediums to lead a counteroffensive and to question the truthiness of them? I'll come back to that in a second. Second, I think we should think about areas that naturally play to our strengths. And here I'm thinking specifically about the value of a free press. In Australia, it was the established media and not the government that played the largest role bringing many of these issues into the public domain. A free press that investigates corruption, exposes massive human rights abuses, shines light on examples of untoward interference in democratic processes and against diaspora communities, which John was talking about. That's an enormous asset. But it can be undercut when the press is unduly muzzled, restrained, or feels the chilling effects of legal judgments that penalize them for doing their job. And let me be more explicit here for American viewers. Democracies need to think about how to better protect their press. And in Australia, I would suggest that that means reforming the libel and suppression order laws that constrict reporting in this critical space. The Australian libel laws are much more restrictive than they are in America. Finally, and not completely unrelated, I would say that anti-corruption and money laundering should become a central focus of our efforts. And let me just offer a very quick story to illustrate this point. I was at a conference when we used to go to conferences with a bunch of academics and policymakers from around the region, including some colleagues from China. And I had the opportunity to comment on the final panel and noted that all our talk of competition should not obscure areas of potential cooperation, of course, between China and the US and others. And there was a lot of nodding of agreement. And I said, one area of particular that holds out particular promise was anti-corruption efforts. After all, Xi Jinping's extensive anti-corruption campaign was rooted in knowledge that corruption stifles development, degrades legitimacy, and can erode sovereignty. And considering how core this idea is to Xi Jinping, wouldn't Beijing want to join the US and others in launching a regional anti-corruption effort? And I bring up that point only to say you can imagine the squirms that this induced in my Chinese colleagues. And it was somewhat spectacular to watch because much of the CCP's external efforts are, of course, rooted in being opaque, non-transparent, and encouraging elite capture.
Charlie, great points. I wish we had more time to go into even deeper, but I want to move on because we're running out of time here. And I want to turn back to Harry and then on to John for kind of closing remarks and thoughts about where we should be going. And Harry, if you think about not just what the government does, but think of the think tank world, your former life and the life you've put on hold at the moment, but maybe going back to eventually, what is the role of research institutions and universities and the press, as Charlie's underscored, in trying to contribute to solutions, as well as the private sector? As I was asking Sam, how do we engage effectively with the private sector, given the fact there are very different views coming out of, say, big tech versus governments, and who brings them together?
Sure, and it's not easy, but to Sam's point about how there's foundational questions that needs to be answered and work that needs to be done to get more meat on the bones of what we mean when we talk about values in our technology. I think that Charles' point about being bracingly transparent in these conversations will help get us there. I think there's a reason why the Cyberspace Solarium Commission report, which got a little bit of criticism for being a relatively defensively oriented document in its tone and tenor, had as one of its primary pillars passing a data privacy law. Because that would start to put the United States more formally into dialogue with other major democracies about how to think about those issues and how to think about authorities around data and information. And to that end, I think that the United States does need to be in dialogue about those things, but the philosophical and legal diversity of the United States and our closest Pacific democratic allies, countries like Australia, Japan, South Korea, democracies like Taiwan, places where we have while a kind of fuzzy, largely overlapping sense of democratic comity, we have striking legal diversity, and that can be a source of learning, but also a source of advantage and complementarity to each other. Our authorities in the cyber and information spaces can vary greatly across these countries. And by partnering with one another, we can find different perspectives and approaches that we may not be able to pursue on our own because of our authorities and legal historical backgrounds, but that we are able to pursue more effectively together. But I also, on the note about engagement with industry, it does seem like this topic is becoming harder to avoid, and it's, I think, prompting more frank engagement between industry and government than it has in years past. And that's very encouraging to me. And we're not yet where we need to be, but we are speaking more frankly about the issues at hand.
Thank you, Harry. And John, I mean, there's a lot still on the table here to try to figure out where we go from here. But I wonder if you can just weave into your closing sort of thoughts here over the next few minutes, your response even to the Anchorage diplomacy, when you think about how that plays in the Indo-Pacific. How does it play in Australia when you think about the exchange that was happened? From my perspective, Yang Jiechi did the same thing he did in Trump Tower in 2016 in private. He gave a 2-hour harangue to the Trump people who were not ready for it. In Anchorage, the American team was ready for it. They gave him back some of it, even in public. And then, of course, he proceeded to dismiss America as unworthy of talking about a position of strength because Black Lives Matter or other things. Anyway, but I'm just wondering, how does that actually play in your view in the region and in Australia as you think about where can Australia and the United States alliance go now to try to address important facets of this challenge?
Sure. Just to begin with the Anchorage optics, I think overall it was very good for the United States and not so good for China, because as you said, Patrick, and as we all know, this stuff happens behind doors all the time. That is how the Chinese talk, certainly how the Chinese talk to us, a smaller country, and increasingly it's how the Chinese talk to you guys, a more powerful country. But the public doesn't know that. And it was a very smart thing, whether it was Blinken or Sullivan, to ensure the press remain to see that and to, in a sense, encourage the Chinese to show their true faces. So when now we hear American or Australian leaders say that the Chinese are bullies, we have actual footage of that. So from that point of view, that's extremely important. Make a slightly broader point, in terms of the narratives, in terms of information, in terms of China's strategic positioning and strategic messaging. Look, I think China succeeds not because it has the answers, but because it's better at marketing, because it's better at controlling and suppressing and influencing conversation discourse. So if you look at the areas where we haven't really in the past attacked China, the competence of the CCP. Now, that's something you hear all the time, that the CCP and its authoritarian system is way more competent than the chaotic Americans. Now, COVID has helped to, I guess there's mixed reviews, but it's certainly the initial stages of COVID has shown the weaknesses of the Chinese institutions and decision-making processes. Much of the region still doesn't really know much about Chinese domestic fragilities, because China, particularly under Xi Jinping, has been very good at promoting perceived strengths and suppressing actual weaknesses, right? That's something which I think should be put out there by the government, but also by the free press and think tankers like ourselves. Look at the issue of the CCP Chinese influence within Australia, within the United States, within democratic countries, and we're told that it is racist to attack the Chinese Communist Party or to even raise the issue that the Chinese Communist Party is doing something wrong. Well, sunlight matters, and the word sunlight has been used by a few people on this panel. It matters because it shows that in this context, it's the Chinese Communist Party which has weaponized race, not us, not Western democracies. It's the Chinese Communist Party which has tried to weaponize Chinese diasporas within their home countries. So that is the CCP weaponizing race, not us. And finally, the issue of China or the PRC being undeterrable, that really is a crucial one. If you think something's undeterrable, then you're the only one who has to compromise. And it's in a strategic sense, I think it's only really in the last 2 or 3 years where the United States, Australia, Japan, they have really begun to talk seriously about ways of imposing costs and deterring the Chinese. I think the early signs are, well, I know the early signs are, any country is deterrable, including the People's Republic of China. We're starting to think seriously about imposing costs, imposing prohibitions on Beijing. And I think that has to continue, not just from a strategic point of view, but from a messaging point of view. We do need to see that we can constrain or change the calculations of the Chinese Communist Party. If we do that, then that will encourage other states, smaller states, hedging states, to hedge differently. And so I think that will be a better space that we should aim for.
Well, John, those are terrific comments to close on and to think about, I think, an optimistic view of where we're going. We have a lot of challenges. I mean, the thing about democracy is that there's a great deal of responsibility on individual commitment to the rule of law and to society, rather than expecting some central organ to control every thought, every word. And that means everybody who listens in Australia or the United States has a responsibility to try to be part of a solution on making the truth a real value, in that the technology is, as Sam said, value neutral. It's up to us to inject the kind of democratic values that Harry also spoke about in terms of trying to operationalize those liberal democratic values, even if, as Sam said, we don't know yet whether we agree on what liberal democracy comprises in the 2020s. That's a debate worth having, and maybe one that we can have at Hudson and think tanks, along with the Wilson Center and ASPE, and even when Harry comes back out of the government, wherever he lands, if it's back at CNAS or elsewhere. I hope all 4 of you will join that discussion. I'm extremely grateful to you, Sam and Charlie, and to Harry and to John for contributing to this great discussion. This has been a fascinating series. I'm overall just awed by how much thought is going into Australia and United States thinking on information power on China in a very complex way, a sophisticated kind of way, not a simple caricature of China or the challenge of information as sort of narrow, but very broad and integrated approaches are needed. So thank you again so much to all of you, and good day.